choice. That's what we believe. We believe we're the chosen people. We don't believe Jews are the chosen people. We don't believe Jews are the ones going to the promised land. We don't think Jews are a part of God. No, Jews are nothing but another part of that same race of devils that come out of Europe. Black people are standing up. Black people are rising up, and they're starting fight.
We were slaves in Egypt. We belong to the Father, ain't no pledge of allegiance. We both to celebrate that killing that he didn't need you. We both to keep the holy days, don't be like the heathen. He said that for
people don't know, that's how these task forces operate. You take a local officer and you have them sign a one-page piece of paper making them a U.S. Marshal, and now, you know, Bob's your uncle, you have a federal officer who's also a state officer. And the courts have so far reflexively treated every one of these guys, to my knowledge, as just purely federal officers, which gives them all sorts of special protections, not the least of which the fact that the U.S. Attorney's Office will often represent them in court, and if not, the federal government will pay attorneys to represent them. But here, we were litigating against the U.S. Attorney in the Western District of Michigan from the outset, and then the case was appealed up, and the DOJ in Washington, D.C., Department of Justice, took the case over. And then, of course, to get to the U.S. Supreme Court, the Solicitor General, the highest appellate attorney in the country for the federal government, is the one who filed the cert petition the first time around. And so you have this sort of full force of the federal government behind defending the case, and that's before you even get to any of the immunities. And then, of course, once you're suing federal officers instead of state officers, you have a whole different set of immunity protections that are much more robust, and increasingly so. I mean, last year, the Supreme Court more or less eviscerated the Bivens cause of action, which allows you to sue federal officers. And so if you take a Grand Rapids police officer who you can definitely sue under the statute, Section 1983, and you magically turn him into a federal officer, the courts will then say, well, actually, you have to be able to explain why this should move forward under Bivens. And the Supreme Court hates Bivens, so you're almost always going to run out of luck there. And so in a case like King's, you file your lawsuit, the violations are obvious. You're saying this guy didn't do anything. So basically everything these officers did violated the Fourth Amendment, because stopping him in the first place was unconstitutional, and things only got worse from there. And they get to come in and they say, well, first of all, we get qualified immunity, so you got to fight that battle. Second of all, we're federal officers, so you can't sue us because there's no cause of action. And then in James's case, the new twist is that if you defeat those arguments, the government will cook up some other theory. And so here, we, in addition to suing James in addition to suing the officers who beat James up, we sued the federal government under a statute called the Federal Tort Claims Act, which is supposed to provide an avenue for relief when federal employees violate tort rights under state law. So it's supposed to expand the amount of accountability that you can get. And the theory that we're fighting and have been for the last few years in the appellate courts then was the government turned around after we defeated the federal qualified immunity and said, no, it's clearly established that what these guys did was unconstitutional. And the Sixth Circuit agreed. It went through every step of the stop and use of force and said, you didn't have a reason to stop him at all because he didn't look like the guy. You had no information. So you couldn't have searched him. You couldn't have searched his wallet. You couldn't have stopped him when he tried to flee. Even if you could, you couldn't have used the level of force you had because a chokehold is deadly force, and this guy hadn't done anything. But even if he was fleeing from a warrant, that was too much force. Still, then the federal government turned around and went to the Supreme Court and said, okay, here's our new theory. This FTCA has something called the judgment bar, which says the judgment in an action shall bar any action against the individual officers. And here, the federal government won in the district court because of qualified immunity. And so essentially, because James can't sue the federal government for Michigan torts, he's not allowed to sue these individual officers for violating the Constitution. And that's the fight we're currently having about this new type of immunity.
I've talked to several people who have had these federal task forces, and they're not wearing body cams like your local cops. Even if their regular employer requires body cams, now that they're on this federal task force, they just bust in your house. They're not wearing a body cam, and you can't get public records information for these federal task forces. And then you can't sue them because it's hard enough to find a lawyer to file these lawsuits anyways.
I pay close attention to policing issues. I kind of always have. And I had no idea that these task forces were operating this way. Like, of course, you hear sometimes the phrase task force and it means a bunch of different things, but you have no clue that these task forces have expanded quietly across the entire country to the point where they're everywhere. I mean, we're talking about West Virginia and Grand Rapids, Michigan. It's not like this is DC, Chicago, New York. These task forces are absolutely everywhere. Even local officials who are kind of, more moderate or whatever, don't realize is once these officers become cross-deputized as task force members, local officials lose all control. Like you said, you can have your police department required to use body cams. They'll be on these task forces without body cams. There will be civil forfeiture laws that your state passes that says you can't seize people's money without due process. And if they're on these task forces, that won't apply. And the craziest one is that, and this is still underdeveloped, and we've talked to a lot of people about these issues, is even if something is so egregious that the local prosecutor wants to charge one of these officers with a crime. So, for instance, there was a case in Texas where a bank robbery task force with a local officer resulted in the officer shooting and killing a suspect under very egregious circumstances such that the local prosecutor charged him with murder. The Fifth Circuit threw the case out and said local prosecutors can't prosecute federal officers for doing their job.
The officer removal statute.
Yeah, well, it's even more than that. It's just the supremacy clause was the theory in that case, Kleinert, Kleinert versus state of Texas, and therefore you can't charge, these guys that are supposed to be within like your direct control as a local prosecutor with a crime if you want to. What we say to local and state officials is the only way that you can stop this is by preventing your officers being on these task forces to begin with. A lot of people don't even know what's happened. And it's one of those things, and I think this is true with a lot of this immunity stuff, is just they've been slowly boiling this frog for 60 years now. And people are finally getting wise to it, but realizing all at once that there's basically nothing you can do right now, short of digging us out of the problem, basically back to where things were in 1965.
Let's talk just real quick legal gymnastics. Like, is there, in your opinion, a way around this issue that?
Now, basically, what they're doing is they're using the same. These are the same tactics they started from the civil rights era up until, I would even go so far as to say this started from the Jim Crow era. Now, some people may argue with me. I know I got a lot of, them people watching my page and, them people. But you see, they doing this to your people too. They doing this to every American citizen. Okay? You're not going to be able to escape from this anymore. I know you thought it was over with. I know you did. I know you thought that this stuff would just happen to us and you can just say, just follow the law. Don't run. Don't be a criminal. Don't walk down the street. Don't be outside. Don't come to the door with a gun. Don't come to the door, period. They're turning our police, they're turning our state and city police and the federal agents, federal officers, so that they are held, they cannot be held responsible or accountable for anything that they do while acting as a police officer. This is where we're at in this country right now. I'm starting to understand why they didn't want all those federal Republican judges to be put in place. Because they still want to push this old boy narrative, but it's even worse than that. It's basically the 1% against everyone. Because this is the 1% pushing this. The same people that's been in power have been pushing this paradigm, pushing black against white. We gotta stop this. You can have a difference in opinion, but don't take or don't try to attack people's history just to try to push yourself up. But I'm going off on a tangent. We need to start analyzing more of these situations. I'm glad we had body cams, but the thing is if they can go around without body cams, then we can't do any type of investigations on what they're doing. There need to be citizens boards where we can do a purview on the federal government, not just the state, not just the city, on the federal government. This is ridiculous. We've gotten to the point in this country where they can do whatever they want to the citizens. All of a sudden, you put a badge on a person, they can violate anybody else. They can be. Now I'm going to show you exactly what I'm talking about. I'm going to show you how they've been using police or police have been doing what they want to people. And they've been they'll have an informant, criminal informant, doing criminal acts, then turn the tables on innocent people that they're attacking to put them in jail for months, almost years. Then you're beating on men in the street. You're just walking up to them and saying, "Hey, who are you?" And if they say who they are and it's not who you want, you just say, "Oh no, you who are you? The person I'm looking for anyway," and just start beating on them. Not identify yourself, not say who you are, not even have a body cam on you. None of that. You can just start beating on people. But you're gonna see. You're gonna see. And tell me more about how this man should have just been, he shouldn't have resisted. How can you resist someone that you don't know is accosting you? It's just, if I can walk out my door and somebody just walks up to me randomly with no type of identifying marker saying who they are and just start asking me questions. We have this, for some reason, there has been a promotion of degradation in our understanding of the law, of the policies, and of the things that make this country operate, and how they have slowly, as you see it in this clip, that they've slowly started to erode our rights. And people, a lot of times when things have happened to me in my life, and people didn't understand why I reacted in a certain way, but then that they also notice, which is why a lot of people follow what I say, they also notice that if I have any encounters with the law, I'm going to be good. I'm going to be great. Because one thing I know is that I got certain rights. I know that these rights could be violated because this is what this country has been about. It's always violated my people's rights anyway. But I know because if you don't know the rules, they can violate you. If you do know the rules, they got a harder chance at it. And that's why you see most of these videos where you'll see a video where it looks like the person is in the wrong for going against what the officer says. Like in the 2000s, a lot of those videos started coming out with, as we got the body cams and everything else and people started recording, we started seeing that people were going against what they said. And you had so many people, in different groups that were saying that, oh, they're part of this and they're part of that. But no, you have to be a constitutionalist. You have to understand that we have certain privileges and we have rights in this country. But these privileges and rights are not afforded by man. They're afforded by God, by the Almighty, or whatever you want to call the being that has made this place that we live in and that we live in existence. The life, reality, everything we are. That's the concepts of America. The concepts that you can't just trample upon people. They did this thing, they did all this up from the 1600s all the way up into 1776. And then we rebelled. I'm not on here promoting rebellion. But what I'm going to tell you is we can't stand for anyone stepping on our rights and trying to adjudicate away our rights. We need to legally change this government. It's not for the people anymore. It's for the few. Okay? We need to change what's going on. All right, I'm gonna take you out to the next clip. Drop what you think. What you think about the situation in the comments. Like, comment, subscribe, and let's keep moving. Cause y'all know I can go on a rant for days. Thanks for watching to the end. If you still watching, thanks for watching. All right, let's go to the next clip.
In jail wrongfully for 2 years. I mean, is that a fair characterization?
A St. Paul police officer named Heather Waker began in 2008 a sex trafficking investigation that essentially she just made up. The Department of Justice has a conviction rate over 99%. And in this case, ultimately 33 people were charged with federal crimes, and not a single one of them was convicted or took a plea deal. And so this was just a spectacular failure for the federal government via its use of this cross-deputized St. Paul officer named Heather Waker, who framed a bunch of people, my client included.
I was put in jail for 17 months because an officer lied about me.
And has thus far completely gotten away scot-free with it. Right now, she's still a sergeant in the St. Paul Police Department. She's still employed, making six figures. In fact, she was recently sued again in her capacity as a St. Paul cop.
I'm a coach. I originally became a police officer to try and stop domestic violence and try to make a difference in some of the victims' lives. Being a mom myself and having several kids, it's you can kind of look at things in kind of a different perspective, and just like we bring a caring, nurturing flavor to a scene. I think you should come to St. Paul Police Department and work with all the great officers here. We're all supportive of each other, and we treat each other like family.
Welcome back to the Civil Rights Lawyer channel. This is the most insane case that you have never heard about. That was St. Paul, Minnesota police officer Heather Waker. The U.S. 8th Circuit Court of Appeals held that this police officer had likely fabricated a non-existent child sex trafficking ring and apparently falsified testimony in court and to a grand jury. This led to the false arrest of 30 Somali refugees, some of whom spent years in federal prison, including the Institute for Justice's client here, Hamdi Mohammed. This is absolutely insane, and there's been no accountability. There have been no successful lawsuits against her, and she's still working there in St. Paul. As you can see, those promotional clips from their YouTube channel were filmed after a federal court had found that she is a liar. But it's not over yet. There's still a pending lawsuit against this corrupt police officer. I have Patrick Giacomo, an attorney with the Institute for Justice, who has returned to the channel to discuss this case, to discuss the crazy facts, and to discuss why this case is so important for government accountability and for our constitutional rights, and to tell you how you can help, because your help is needed. Well, your money is needed, and you also need to help us and help the IJ get this story out there. Take a look.
A St. Paul police officer named Heather Waker began in 2008 a sex trafficking investigation that essentially she just made up. And over the course of several years, eventually was able to indict about 30 people, almost all of them Somali refugees, in this big scheme that she claimed had to do with human trafficking. Although 30 people were indicted by federal prosecutors in Tennessee, interestingly, not federal prosecutors in Minnesota who refused to take the case. The few that actually made it to trial were eventually acquitted by the 6th Circuit. And in something I've never seen before, we got a 6th Circuit opinion affirming the acquittals that basically said, we've done a painstaking review of the case and the case history, and we found instances of this officer, Heather Waker, lying repeatedly. And we have come to the conclusion that what we're about to describe in our opinion here is a likely fictitious story of sex trafficking. That all fell apart completely. In 2011, Hamdi and two of her friends ended up being attacked by a fourth girl named Muna Abdul Qadir. And unbeknownst to Hamdi and her friends, Muna was one of the secret witnesses that Heather Waker had been using to fabricate this crime ring that she would later be prosecuting. When Muna attacked the girls with a knife, they called 911, and Muna took off and hid in a neighbor's apartment, and she called Heather Waker. Now, Heather was concerned because Muna was a key witness for her, and so to protect Muna and make sure she didn't get arrested, what Heather Waker did was call up the on-scene officers via their car computers, because she's, again, a St. Paul cop. These are Minneapolis cops, and so she understands the local practices. They get a notice saying to call Officer Heather Waker out of St. Paul immediately, which they do. And when they call her, she feeds them a line of lies about how what actually happened here was that Hamdi and her friends were seeking to intimidate a federal witness. And so the police on the scene should arrest them instead of arresting Muna Abdul Qadir. And that's exactly what does happen. The three girls were arrested for witness tampering under Minnesota law. Then the next day, Officer Waker swears out an affidavit in support of federal charges and has all three of these girls charged with witness tampering under federal law, charges that carried the potential of life in prison. Hamdi and one of her other friends spent about 2 years in federal prison waiting for trial. Ultimately, the charges against Hamdi were dropped, but her friends Habo and Ifra were both tried and both acquitted in the federal system. And so just to zoom out on the likelihood of all of this kind of just being chance and not Heather Waker's malfeasance putting almost 33 people in prison, the Department of Justice has a conviction rate over 99%. And in this case, ultimately, 33 people were charged with federal crimes, and not a single one of them was convicted or took a plea deal. And so this was just a spectacular failure for the federal government via its use of this cross-deputized St. Paul officer named Heather Waker, who framed a bunch of people, my client included, and has thus far completely gotten away scot-free with it. Right now, she's still a sergeant in the St. Paul Police Department. She's still employed, making six figures. In fact, she was recently sued again in her capacity as a St. Paul cop for tricking her way into a man's apartment without a warrant to search it. And in that case, the federal court granted summary judgment against her. The trick in this case, and all of these cases that came after Heather Waker was found out, is that what they have done is the sort of two-step immunity shuffle where they've said, first, give me qualified immunity. The courts have routinely tossed that out. In fact, the way the Eighth Circuit put it when it rejected her claim in the case of Hamdi and her friends was any reasonable officer would know that lying to have another officer arrest an innocent person to protect a sham investigation is unlawful. So that kind of gives you a flavor for the sort of contempt that the courts have had for Heather Waker's behavior. But to get out of any accountability, what she's done instead is say, I was cross-deputized as a U.S. Marshal, and so you can only sue me as a federal officer. And as a federal officer, there's no Bivens left because my case isn't exactly like Webster Bivens' case, and therefore I can't be sued at all. And so far, she's won on these theories. Hamdi's case is the last case standing. And the issue that we're now advancing is, even if she was acting in some federal capacity as a cross-deputized officer, she was also acting under color of state law and can be subject to liability under Section 1983 because, of course, she is and was a St. Paul police officer. And a variety of other facts support the fact that when she did what she did here against Hamdi and her friends, she was acting, at least in this simultaneously as a state acting under color of state law and can be subject to liability under Section 1983 because, of course, she is and was a St. Paul police officer. And a variety of other facts support the fact that when she did what she did here against Hamdi and her friends, she was acting, at least in this simultaneously as a state officer and a federal officer. And the added wrinkle here is, in Hamdi's friend Ifra's case, this 1983 issue has already been decided by the Eighth Circuit, and they concluded, based on the facts in Ifra's complaint, that Officer Waker was acting exclusively under color of federal law. So when this case came back down after the Supreme Court declined to grant review on the issue of Bivens in Hamdi's case, we kind of thought, we'll be stuck with the same facts that Ifra's case had. But as it turned out, we found some rather crucial documents pertaining to several task forces that are relevant to Heather Waker's behavior, the first of which is a task force called the Gerald D. Vick Task Force, which we've found out since then and have sought to amend our complaint to put this before the court, is a St. Paul-led task force. Explicitly in the documents, it says this is a St. Paul-led task force with the purpose of stopping human trafficking in Minnesota. And Heather Waker's entire investigation, the one that she was trying to cover up for when she had Hamdi and her friends arrested, was a St. Paul investigation undertaken through this Vick task force, and through which Heather Waker had always been supported in some capacity by federal officers, proving that the federal component of what happened here didn't somehow take this out of the space of Section 1983, but instead just showed that the federal officers were cooperating to support Heather Waker's investigation. And the other two documents, which we found, are documents from other task forces, because something I should also point out, there's been no discovery in this case, or to my knowledge, any of the other cases against Heather Waker, because the government has been so successful in having them dismissed so quickly. We found other memoranda of understanding for task forces between the St. Paul Police Department and the FBI. So that's Heather Waker's employer on the one hand and the sponsor for her federal marshalship on the other. And those documents specifically say, if officers are sued for constitutional violations, federal officers are sued under Bivens, and state and cross-deputized officers are to be sued under Section 1983. And so now we have this whole new nucleus of facts that prove that Heather Waker was acting under color of state law, and the government is fighting like hell to prevent us from amending the complaint and simultaneously asking the district court to dismiss the case without really even digging into it any further. I think there have been more.
Okay, so I want y'all to go to the Civil Rights Lawyers page. Actually watch the whole full video. It's called "Crooked Cop Sent Innocent Girl to Prison for 2 Years." I'll most likely put this in the caption. This is what we face in this country. I mean, we face the fact that you have an authority, you have a so-called government, which is like our, like our parents, and these people are put in place. I mean, they're just citizens just like us, and they did protect the police officers, the military, and they allow them to violate our rights. And you see very clearly that they're continuously blocking any type of suit, any type of taking away of qualified immunity. No, she keeps jumping back and forth. Oh, I was acting under a federal jurisdiction. This is ridiculous. But these are the things that they're doing to our people. And when I mean our people, I mean the American citizen. They are doing this to us, and we're doing nothing about it. I'm going to need people to start getting up and start saying things, at least speaking against it. Because they say that when you don't say anything, that's called acquiescence. You agree. If you don't refute something, you agree to it. Get them pens right. Like, get them speeches together. We need to start making changes. I say we need to call for, a national convention so that we can just basically squash everything, go back to the base bones of it, the Constitution and the amendments, and we start fresh. Okay? Because honestly, I'm going to say this, black people never had we didn't have any parts in any of this. We had no parts in any of these laws being made. We had no parts in any say-so in the government. Up until almost the 60s or the 70s, and even then, we still don't have much of a say in anything. So, just to jump off of that, the fact that this woman used an informant to then put an African, another black person in jail, and over 30 of them, refugees, put 30 of them in jail for over a year. Where's the due process at? And then it was based on a lie with no factual evidence besides the fact of an informant. How can a so-called witness have such immunity to the point where and such infallible, it can be so infallible that you don't even question anything that they do, anything that they say? This girl was about to stab these 3 girls, and then this cop allowed this girl to go from being the criminal to being a victim with a lie. I mean, this sums it up. This sums up the issue with our country and with our government. Tell me what you think about this in the comments. I'm out, and peace.
Sidewalk. Suddenly, he's grabbed by multiple police officers wearing plain clothes.
I'd gotten out of work early, walking on the sidewalk on a sunny summer day, going to my internship. I was calling my sister at the time and somewhat distracted by looking at my phone. When 2 men approached me, stepped toward me off the curb and said, hey, who are you? And I said, I'm James. And they asked me, is that your real name? I said, yes, that's my real name. But one of them stepped behind me, boxed me out, and took my wallet out of my back pocket. So I went to run, to flee, and I was tackled and ultimately beaten pretty severely.
He has no idea they're police officers. He thinks he's getting mugged. Bystanders think he's getting mugged. They call 911. It looks like a mugging.
I was screaming for someone to call the police.
Oh my God. They're beating him up. Like, they're literally assaulting him.
Do you have any weapons on you at all?
No, sir, I thought they were trying to mug me.
You can do nothing and just be in the wrong place at the wrong time. You have the situation where James is like actually innocent of absolutely everything. It's not like they tried to stop him for jaywalking and he ran away. They thought he was someone he wasn't.
They take his wallet, they beat him, but they were cops.
Why are officers in plain clothes doing stops? Like, the whole point of being in plain clothes is so people can't identify you as an officer.
Not just any cops, they were federalized into a task force.
You take a local officer and you have them sign a one-page piece of paper making them a U.S. Marshal, and now, Bob's your uncle, you have a federal officer who's also a state officer.
The police came, and then that was when I realized that they weren't muggers, but they were just police detective and an FBI agent.
And then after they misidentified James and beat the crap out of him, instead of being like, oh gosh, we're so sorry, big mistake on our part, they charge him with 3 felonies. You have this sort of full force of the federal government behind defending the case, and that's before you even get to any of the immunities.
I remember being loaded into the back of the ambulance, just being so stricken by what had all had just happened. I was in a great deal of pain when I got to the hospital, and I remember everyone there, the staff, the nurse, even the officer that was in charge of watching me. As I was cuffed to my bed, I remember him loosening the cuffs and telling me that I shouldn't be there. I went directly from the hospital to the jail cell.
You're an innocent victim. Can you sue them? Qualified immunity is bad enough, but imagine in America where the federal government can just go in and deputize your local law enforcement and take them completely out of state and local control. Imagine that they can then just violate your constitutional rights and there's basically nothing that you can do about it. Imagine that they have more than just qualified immunity, but you just can't sue them at all. That is what is at issue in this important case, King versus Brownback, currently being appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court by the Institute for Justice for a second time. I recently had the opportunity to talk to one of their lawyers, one of the top civil rights lawyers in the country, Patrick Giacomo, who has already argued this case before the U.S. Supreme Court once. He explains the backstory about what happened to James King here, as well as the extraordinary lengths that the government has gone, that your government has gone to keep an innocent victim from ever having his day in court and seeing a jury over the undisputed, really, violation of his constitutional rights. This is an extremely important case because we are seeing these federal task forces pop up all over the country. And if courts take the position that state and local officers are effectively federal officers, they basically can't be sued. Courts will say, yeah, he violated your constitutional rights, but there's nothing that you can do about it. And so far, that's what's happened here to James King. He was completely innocent, and local police officers beat the hell out of him, but he couldn't sue them. The Institute for Justice is asking the Supreme Court to fix this problem. Here's some insight from one of the nation's top civil rights lawyers about this case and about what you can do to help. I just watched the video that you guys put out 3 years ago.
I've been working on that case. Like, I've been in touch with James since 2014. So we're coming up, the incident took place in the summer of 2014. So we're coming up on 9 years since this happened. And
Wow.
we've been litigating since basically as soon as he was acquitted for the criminal charges. Now we're asking the Supreme Court to hear the case for the second time. The main villain in this story, the police officer here, he retired like several years ago.
Imagine if it was this difficult for somebody to recover in a car wreck case.
Sure. Or the thing I always say is, like, you know, in this case, this was just an unreasonable misidentification. Like, you've got this situation where you're kind of scratching your head still to this day. Like, why was there a federal task force searching for a guy wanted on a Michigan warrant for a crime he committed in Michigan, and they're looking for him in the city, Grand Rapids, where the crime took place, which is like, you know, 130 miles away from the nearest state border, and everything else is like Lake Michigan, so he's not going anywhere. And they misidentified James for this guy because I'm sure they were just dragnetting. Like, James looks nothing like this guy. The guy was like 6 years older. He had blonde hair, yada yada yada. And you're like, what were they even doing there to begin with? Like, why? How is this a federal matter? And then after they misidentified James and beat the crap out of him, instead of being like, oh gosh, we're so sorry, you know, big mistake on our part, they charge him with 3 felonies, and that trial is over and done with like 9 months later, and he gets acquitted on all 3 charges for which he was facing decades in prison. He testified in his own defense.
I mean, how did they first misidentify him?
So the story is, this was summer of 2014. At the time, James was a student at Grand Valley State University, and he was walking. It was in the afternoon. He was walking between 2 summer jobs he had. He had one job where he was laying fiber for a local company, and then he had another job at a science nonprofit. He's like a computer guy. These 2 men who he didn't know and who were in plain clothes and had on like a backwards baseball cap and a beard came up to him and started asking him all these questions, and he was kind of like, you know, caught off guard, answered a couple questions like, well, what's your name? It said James, which is his name. And they quickly pushed him up against an unmarked SUV. They never identified themselves as police officers. One of them grabbed his wallet out of his pocket, and he thought he was being mugged. He yelled out, "Are you mugging me?" and tried to run away, at which point these officers tackled him, choked him unconscious. And then when he woke up with this officer's arm still around his neck, James bit the cop, and then the cop beat the ever-loving hell out of James. And the language he used in James's criminal trial was they punched him as hard as I could, as fast as I could, and as many times as I could. James was screaming for help. Bystanders see this happening and call 911. There's a little bit of footage that survived, and we'll talk about that in a second. And these bystanders are saying, like, we think we're seeing a murder. Like, they had no idea these guys were cops. Ultimately, uniformed cops did show up on the scene. And at that point, James is like, you know, out of it because he's just gotten seriously beaten. And so that you've got this dash cam footage, and James is being handcuffed, and he's like, are these guys real police? Like, what's going on here? Meanwhile, one of the officers who showed up walked around and one by one stopped every person who was there and made them delete footage that they'd shot. And so there was footage of the beating itself, but that didn't survive. And so what we have is just a couple short videos, which are on our website, of kind of the immediate aftermath, while you still have these bystanders saying, like, on the spur of the moment, like their present sense of the situation, like, oh my God, they were being brutal. Like, what was going on there? We thought they were going to kill him. And then, you know, the other person be like, yeah, they were really fucking him up. And so you have the cops show up. Obviously, at this point, whatever happened before this, they know that this isn't the guy they're looking for. And so to instead of letting him go, they take him to the hospital where he's handcuffed to a bed, and then they book him into jail, and he's charged with several counts related to like assaulting police officers of various types. And as it turned out, these 2 guys were a Grand Rapids police detective named Todd Allen and an FBI agent named Douglas Brownback, who were on a fugitive task force. And for reasons unknown, they were looking for a guy named Aaron Davison, who was wanted on a warrant of having broken into his boss's apartment and stolen some empty pop cans, because Michigan has a 10-cent bottle deposit, and some bottles of liquor. So the crime underlying all of this was a guy that had stolen some liquor and some empty pop cans. And for some reason, the local police couldn't find this guy immediately upon going to his last known address. And so they kicked it to this federal task force, which is then like waiting around looking for this guy. The guy had blonde hair. He was like 26 or 27. He had blue eyes. And he was, you know, the height range they gave was like between 5'7" and 6'2". And so you're like, okay, so this is someone that matches the description of like 20% of the Grand Rapids metro area. They stopped James instead. James has brown hair, brown eyes, is much shorter than this guy, was 6-ish years younger than this guy. They asked him what his name was. He said James, not Aaron. None of that was enough to dispel their suspicions, apparently, because then everything else took place after that. You have the situation where...
Back to who we are, I don't see how you don't see.
You're Lazarus. You're the dry bones. You're the prodigal son. You're the lost sheep. You're the people about whom the Bible is speaking, who will stand up in the last days when the trumpet is sounded.
I shall keep it until the end. Give me understanding, and I shall keep your law. Yea, I shall observe it with my whole heart. Hallelujah.
Hallelujah.